Get started. What we're going to do today and Wednesday is something a little bit out of order from the textbook. Last time we met, we got to test you over your knowledge on the blood as well as the muscles. If I were to follow the order of the textbook, they run through all the parts of the cardiovascular system in a row. They go from the blood straight into the heart, straight into the lymphatic, or into the blood vessels. Then they talk about the lymphatic and immune systems. Well, I like to talk about the lymphatic and immune systems right after I talk about the blood. Okay? Because those two things are so correlated with one another. In fact, we'll talk about the blood here, I believe, on the very next slide. Okay? It works out really well when we don't have a spring break right there between them. Okay, because we talk about blood, you test on it, then we talk about the lymphatic system, and some of that stuff is going to be just, boom, right, fresh in your mind. Some of that stuff should hopefully be fresh in your mind because it hasn't been that long ago, but it will be a little bit less fresh. Okay. One of the things that we talked about in our blood were our white blood cells, which we learned provide us with protection. Okay. One of the major types of white blood cells that we talked about were lymphocytes. And we learned previously that they were the major soldiers of the immune system. And I like the term soldier a lot. It's kind of my analogy for the lymphatic and immune systems. And that's why I have a picture of a Buckingham Palace guard here on our first page. Because I like to think of our white blood cells as guards protecting our palace, which our palace is our body. So let me kind of use some analogies with guards, military, okay, armed forces, that kind of stuff, when I'm talking about these two systems. Now, these two systems, and I put systems kind of in air quotes, really are just kind of the same thing. Okay. The lymphatic aspect of things is basically the organs and structures. Okay. The immune system aspect of things are the responses that take place within those organs. So how we provide protection, how we use antibodies, how we perform phagocytosis. The first, third or so of this lecture details the lymphatic system. We're talking about the lymph nodes and the spleen and those various organs. And then we'll talk about what happens inside of those organs. And that's what the immune system stuff is all about. So let's read through here. Lymphatic system consists of a fluid called lymph, okay, which the word lymph actually begins the word lymphatic, also begins the word lymphatic vessels, lymphatic tissues, and lymph nodes, lymphocytes. So it's a very lymph-related cluster here. Okay. So, fluid called lymph, vessels called lymphatic vessels, transport lymph, a number of structures and organs containing lymphatic tissue, as well as red bone marrow where stem cells develop into various types of blood cells that include lymphocytes. Function of it, or its design, is to maintain a balance of fluid in the internal environment, and since it is related to circulation of fluids, it's part of the circulatory system, along with our blood and our cardiovascular blood vessels. And as you can see, one of the functions of the lymphatic system is to drain excess interstitial fluid. We've learned previously, and this goes back to our very first lecture about interstitial fluid. Remember, this is the fluid that bathes our body cells, okay, and it is formed when fluid leaves our blood. Okay, and we've learned previously that that fluid that leaves our blood becomes interstitial fluid is not going to just hang out in our interstitial spaces, but will instead be taken up into our blood, becoming intracellular fluid. Now that fluid then will become interstitial fluid as it leaves the cells, because there's always this circulation going on, and typically the fluid gets brought back into the blood to become blood plasma again. Sometimes that fluid actually gets brought into the lymphatic system. And that's where it becomes lymph. Okay. That way it can float through the lymphatic vessels and be filtered. Because that's what we want to happen, so that we can carry out immune responses. which is where we protect against harmful things like toxins and bacteria and viruses. And that's going to be what we really detail towards the second half to 2/3 of this lecture. Okay. Something that we'll talk about a little bit later in the semester is how we absorb fats and fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K, okay, which is different than how we absorb everything else that we put into our bodies through our diet. Okay. For example, sugars and water, amino acids, they get absorbed into our bloodstream directly, okay, through the walls of the small intestine into blood capillaries. Lymph is going to pick up fats, fat-soluble vitamins, by way of these things called lacteals, which we find in the little folds of our small intestine. So we'll talk about lacteals later in the semester, okay, when we get into digestion. Okay. Ultimately, those fats and fat-soluble vitamins do end up in the blood, but they just don't get pulled in directly to it. Okay. And that's something that, like I said, we'll talk about later in the semester. Basic components of the lymphatic system includes that interstitial fluid that I was just talking about, okay, which is, once again, the fluid that fills the space between our cells. Plasma that does not get reabsorbed by the circulatory system becomes part of the interstitial fluid. Okay, and if it gets brought into the lymphatic system, it becomes lymph, a colorless, watery-appearing fluid. And then what we're going to talk about for several slides here are various parts of organs, or various organs that are made up of lymphoid tissue, which is a type of tissue within the lymphatic system containing lymphocytes and other defense cells. This is, for example, the type of tissue that will form our lymph nodes. And not only does it form lymph nodes, but it also forms some of our other lymphatic organs, which we classify into two groups based on how they function. We have primary and secondary, and we've seen this before. We talked about like primary endocrine and secondary endocrine. It's different here. It relates to their function, not whether or not they produce hormones, which is how, for example, we classified the endocrine organs as primary, secondary. If they are primary lymphatic organs, they have this property of immunocompetence, or allowing cells to become immunocompetent. If you break down that word, begins with immuno, which you can think of immuno as in immunity or protection, and then competent, okay, which means that you are capable of something. Like if I said you're competent in areas of physiology, you are capable of knowing things about physiology. So the word immunocompetent means that it is capable of protection or mounting an immune response. Okay. The two primary lymphatic organs are the red bone marrow, which we've mentioned a little bit in this class before. We learned previously that's where we make blood cells. Hematopoiesis or hemopoiesis was that process. And we've also learned a little bit about the thymus before. We learned previously about its role in the making of hormones. So we discussed it in our endocrine organ or endocrine system lecture. Okay. I like to think of these two organs, or these two parts of our body anyway, like boot camp, okay, which is where soldiers go when they first join the military, and they undergo training and become competent soldiers, right? Okay. Somewhere generally here in the States is where boot camp is held, and it's several weeks in length, and you're cut off from the outside world so that you can focus on becoming the best soldier that you can be. Okay. Our white blood cells do the same thing. Okay. And then when they become competent soldiers, just like competent Marines or Navy SEALs, they leave boot camp, and then they can go off and do what they're supposed to do, which is where the secondary lymphatic organs come into play, which is, as it states, the site where most immune responses take place. Our lymph nodes especially, but also our spleen and lymphatic nodules. Okay. Now that last sentence or two down there at the bottom is really just related to anatomy-based stuff. How we classify them relates based on, or another way to classify them is based on whether or not they have a capsule. And that's not really important to us, so I'm just going to kind of breeze past that. Okay. Now we'll get into those various organs a little bit in greater detail, but we've already mentioned lymph, so I want to talk about it again. We learned previously that we form lymph when interstitial fluid is not taken up by our blood, but instead taken up by lymphatic capillaries. We form about 3 liters a day and drain that lymph back into our bloodstream. The purpose of that is to allow that fluid to get filtered through lymph nodes. Okay. Now, this circulation of lymph is going to follow a little bit of a different manner than the flow of blood. Okay. And that's because the flow of blood is directed because it has a central pumping organ. What's the central pumping organ of your cardiovascular system? Your heart. There is no pumping organ like the heart associated with the lymphatic system. So we pump a lot less lymph each day. Okay. For example, at rest, right now you're probably pumping like 5 liters per minute of blood. We only pump about 3 liters of lymph per day. It's a very significant difference. Okay. But the flow does occur the same way, essentially, as the flow of blood. And it's all due to gradients, which we've talked about gradients before, like concentration gradients, where things moved across the membrane from areas of high to low, right? Well, the flow of fluids, like lymph and blood, are related to pressure gradients. Okay. And we create pressure gradients that move lymph through breathing, actually. And breathing, as we'll learn in a couple weeks, is related to pressure gradients. So some of the stuff we're going to talk about today will be talked about again later in this unit, as well as the next unit. Okay. Let's talk about the 2 main kind of accessory pumps that help our lymph flow. The great thing is these 2 pumps also help the flow of blood back to our hearts to help accomplish what we call venous return. We have a respiratory pump, which the word respiratory implies that it involves our, obviously, respiratory system or our lungs. And this is where pressure gradients are utilized. Okay. When we are in a standing or upright position, fluids, both lymph and blood, have to go against the force of gravity. Okay? Which means they have to go up towards our heart, because that's where our lymph gets dumped back into our circulation, right about the same level as where blood pumps back into the heart. As we breathe in and out, changes in the lungs, and more specifically, the cavity surrounding our lungs, what we call our thoracic cavity, occur, which changes pressure within that area. And if we drop the pressure in our thoracic cavity below the pressure in our abdominal cavity, we have established a pressure gradient, where the pressure is higher in one place than the other. And just like when we go down a concentration gradient, fluid is going to go down a pressure gradient. So that actually kind of helps to suck the flow of lymph upward. The great thing is we'll see the same thing with the flow of blood back to the heart. Okay. We also utilize a muscle pump, which is kind of, I like to think of like milking a cow, where you squeeze on the udder and the milk gets squeezed out. Okay. We're not squeezing with our hands on the udder. Instead, when we squeeze our hands, for example, our muscles are going to squeeze together on vessels, like those lymphatic vessels that you see down there at the bottom. And just like when you squeeze on a cow udder, it forces the fluid out or forward. In this case, we can see where the muscles are contracting, the flow of lymph is going upwards. Where they're relaxed, the flow is not going to end up going backwards because of these valves that exist. Our veins also have valves, so we'll actually see the same principle and very similar picture when we talk about venous return. So both veins and lymphatic vessels have valves to prevent what we call retrograde flow, which retrograde is a fancy word to describe backwards. All right, our first actual organ is an organ that we've talked a little bit about before. I think we spent one whole fancy slide talking about it. And that is our thymus. Actually, this organ, the older we get, becomes smaller and smaller. It shrinks as we get older. So as it states in there, more important in children, actually. It's bigger in kids. Regardless, it's a bilobed organ, so it sits on top of our heart and has two lobes. Okay. And surrounded by a capsule. Now, a lot of these organs that we're going to see are surrounded by a capsule. That's not important. What is important are the extensions of the capsule like this, like my fingers pointing inward. And what that accomplishes is separating the inside of our various organs into little compartments, what we call lobules. Okay. Like I said, when we get, well, our thymus gets smaller as we get older, so it's more important in children. It's a reservoir of lymphocytes. And previously we learned about T cells and B cells, or T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. This is where undifferentiated lymphocytes become T lymphocytes. This is where they develop that immunocompetence. Why do you think we call them T cells? They're not formed in the thymus, they develop in the thymus. They're formed in our bone marrow, but they come to our thymus. Just like when you come to boot camp. You're coming from somewhere else, you're getting trained at boot camp, and then you leave boot camp. That's what the T cells are going to do here. They're going to come in as undifferentiated cells, and they're going to leave as killing machines. If you want to call them that. Okay. Now, each thymic lobule, so each lobule of the thymus consists of an outer cortex and a central medulla. Outer cortex is going to be where you find the very immature pre-T cells. So these are the very original arriving cells coming from the red bone marrow. And this is where they begin their maturation process. You've also got dendritic cells derived from monocytes. We've talked about monocytes before. Those were one of those 5 white blood cells. They assist in T cell maturation. We'll also see dendritic cells found in other places playing other roles in immunity. There's also specialized epithelial cells that help educate T cells through a process called positive selection. So they're kind of like the drill sergeants, helping the T cells become competent. They also surround and serve as a framework for as many as 50 T cells. And the hormones that we talked about previously, like thymopoietin and thymosin, thymic humoral factor, those are produced by these epithelial cells. We didn't have to know all, or you guys didn't have to know all those names of the hormones. All you had to learn previously was that they help T cells mature. Now you know who's producing them. Okay. And we've also learned about macrophages, which develop from monocytes, as we learned previously, perform phagocytosis. They're the big Pac-Man running around shooting stuff up. They can clear out any dead and dying cells. But not a super, super important process for immunity, what we generally think of for macrophages. The inner part of the thymic globules is the medulla, where you find widely scattered More mature T cells. These mature T cells have come here from the cortex. You've also got dendritic cells, epithelial cells, and macrophages. Okay. Some of the epithelial cells form concentric layers, become filled with keratinohyalin and keratin, becoming clusters known as thymic or capsules corpuscles. Not really sure what their role is, but they may serve as the sites of T cell death within the medulla. Once those cells have become immunocompetent, I'm talking the T cells here, they can then leave and go off to battle. Places like our lymph nodes, our spleen, other lymphatic tissue where they can get ready to go to war, as we can say. Let's now talk about one of those places where they go to war, our lymph nodes. We find our lymph nodes along our flow path of our lymphatic fluid, or our lymph, as we call it. These are found along some of our larger lymphatic vessels. You'll find some of them kind of alone by themselves, but in places like our neck and our armpits, the breasts, you'll find clusters of these guys. Okay. What they are just basically oval-shaped filters, filtering out the stuff that's in our lymph. Okay. Inside of them, you have a lot of immune functioning cells. And just like we saw with the thymus, there's a capsule with extensions inward. Okay. You can see that here on the next page. We've got our lymph node here. We've opened it up so that we can see the inside of it. The green shaded color on the outside is our capsule, which is not important until you open it up and see that it projects inward. That projection inward, or those projections inward that kind of look like little fingers, are called trabeculae. Okay. What they create are these irregular sinuses inside of the lymph node. Now, just like within each of those lobules of our thymus, there's an outer cortex and an inner medulla to our lymph nodes. Okay. Now, what happens inside of a lymph node is very cool. First of all, you can see here on this side of our lymph node, there are lots of afferent lymphatic vessels. These are the vessels that carry the lymph into the lymph node, as you can see here with our green arrows directing the flow in. Okay. When that lymph flows inward, it's going to have to go through those various sinuses in a indirect pathway. Okay. It'd be like if the only way you could leave the room would be to walk to the back and then snake your way through all those various desks. Very indirect, very slow means of getting out of here, wouldn't it be? That's what happens to our lymph. Okay. That, and there's only a few exit vessels for what these efferent lymphatic vessels do. So we slow down the flow of lymph tremendously in our lymph nodes. That way the cells that are found in there can go to work. In our cortex, there's actually an outer and an inner. The outer is where you find B cells. We haven't talked much about those yet. Okay, those have come from the bone marrow, B for bone marrow actually. Dendritic cells, follicular dendritic cells, macrophages. Okay, they're going to do their thing. We'll talk about what B cells do, what macrophages do. Cortex contains those T cells that we just talked about, as well as dendritic cells that have come from outside of the lymph node. Medulla is where you find B cells, and then these antibody-producing plasma cells and macrophages. What's neat about a lymph node, besides having this indirect flow, is that there's also kind of like spider webbing inside. And you can kind of see that here with these little white lines, which are reticular fibers. And now, a spider web serves two purposes. Supports the spider. More importantly, it traps the prey, right? And that way the spider can go kill and eat it. Okay. That's what reticular fibers do. They support the spiders. In the case of spiders, we can think of those as like these various immune cells. And the reticular fibers also trap foreign substances like a spider web. And so that's very, very cool. Okay. And that's what this here is saying. Now, unfortunately, lymph nodes can get inflamed, or can even be a site where tumors develop. Okay. If too many microorganisms enter the nodes, phagocytes cannot destroy enough of them, and infection results. Infection of a lymph node is called adenitis. So when you go to the doctor and they're rubbing your neck when you're sick, they're not rubbing your neck because it feels good. They're trying to find out if those cervical lymph nodes are inflamed. It's a telltale sign that you are under the weather. And then when people have, especially like females with a breast exam, where they are checking to feel if there are any lumps. Lumps can develop in those lymph nodes within the female breast, more than men anyway. Not to say men can't get breast cancer, but cancer cells can get lodged in lymph nodes and develop into new tumors if that tumor is malignant anyway, which means it spreads. Our next organ is the spleen. It's actually our body's largest lymph organ. We've just barely mentioned it. Really, probably just one time this semester. Back when we talked about hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis. Those two fancy words that meant the same thing, which was the production of red blood cells. Or, excuse me, just blood cells, not just red blood cells. We learned that our spleen, not they, because there's only one, our spleen helps produce blood cells during fetal life. But as we learned, is not the main site of blood cell production after the first, maybe a few months of pregnancy. The last trimester especially is where the red bone marrow takes over, becomes that site for the rest of our life. So we just barely mentioned it. But it is our largest lymph organ. Okay. It is also built like our thymus and our lymph nodes in that it has a capsule on the outside and then inward extensions called trabeculae, dividing it into compartments. Okay. The parenchyma, or that's a fancy word for functioning part of an organ, of our spleen consists of two parts, or two different kinds of tissues, red pulp and white pulp. White pulp, think of it as more immune function. Okay, it's going to be full of white blood cells. So it consists of lymphocytes and macrophages. Both of those are white blood cells. Blood flowing into the spleen through splenic arteries enters central arteries within our white pulp, and this is where B and T cells can carry out their immune functions like they do on our lymph nodes. Macrophages can destroy pathogens by phagocytosis as well. Our red pulp consists of blood-filled venous sinuses and cords of splenic tissue called splenic cords. Splenic cords consist of red blood cells, macrophages, lymphocytes, plasma cells, and then the three types of granulocytes. Red pulp, think of it more like related to blood functions. Okay. It removes any worn-out blood cells, platelets. That's done by the platelets or the macrophages you find here. Stores up to a third of our body supply of platelets. And as I mentioned just a bit ago and mentioned in our last lecture, during fetal life, early fetal life anyway, it helps with chemo or hematopoiesis. Okay. So really kind of two different functioning tissues. As far as immunity goes, the white pulp is really the important part. Okay. Now, the white pulp is very similar to how lymph nodes function, in that it filters. We just talked about lymph nodes. What was the fluid that lymph nodes filter? Lymph. That filters lymph nodes, or lymph nodes filter lymph. Blood is filtered by the spleen, so that's one of the differences. Okay. Interestingly enough, if the child has a splenectomy, that has a splenectomy, not has a splenectomy, has a splenectomy, which is removal of the spleen. Lymph nodes in the abdominal cavity can enlarge and become splenic in function. Just pretty neat to just demonstrate how adaptable the body really is. Last things I want to talk about, organ-wise or structure-wise, are these collectively things called lymphatic nodules. Egg-shaped masses of lymphatic tissue not surrounded by a capsule. We find them in a layer of what we call lamina propria, which is connective tissue of our mucous membranes. Mucous membranes of several of our tracts that open to the outside world. Gastrointestinal, urinary, respiratory, and reproductive tracts. Since they are associated with mucous membranes, their other name is mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. It's lymphoid tissue associated with mucosa. Or MALT for short. Inside of them, you find lymphocytes and macrophages that can protect against bacteria and other pathogens that might enter these pathogens with food, air, or urine. Although many of them are small and solitary, some occur in large aggregations in specific parts of our body. I'm sure you've all heard of your lymph node or your tonsils and your appendix. Okay. Tonsils, there are 5 of them typically, forming a ring inside of your kind of throat, mouth area, protecting against the stuff that we breathe and eat and drink. Okay. I'm sure some of you guys probably don't even have some of your or any of your tonsils. Okay. When you hopefully are able to survive just fine without them. I'm sure you've all heard of people having their appendix. Some of you might have your appendix taken out. Some of you might even have some of your tonsils and your appendix taken out. And I'm sure you're all doing just fine. Okay. The appendix sometimes gets thought of as just a non-functioning organ. Same thing for your tonsils. They're not non-functioning. They're just like backup. Okay. They're like on secondary call. We survive without them, but they're there in case we need them. At least for people that have them anyway. Yeah. The ones that you probably haven't heard of unless you've taken anatomy and remember me talking about these, which are Pyrus patches, we find those in our mucosa of our small intestinal ileum, the very end of our small intestine. We'll mention those a little bit, but they're not super important. Here's a look at the tonsils. This is really more anatomy-based stuff, but the ring you can see is labeled there, what we call the pharyngeal lymphoid ring. Protects against bacteria and invade tissues around the opening, between our nasal and oral cavities. Typically, there's one pharyngeal adenoid, the posterior wall of our nasal pharynx, 2 palatines, 2 linguals. Of those taken out, generally, we're talking the palatines, because they will kind of get inflamed and kind of just gunk up that area and make it hard to breathe and eat and swallow and all sorts of other things. All right, so that's it for the structures. Now we get to talk about the actual fun, the responses and protection that take place within many of those organs. So our immune system is going to consist of innate mechanisms conferring a non-specific defense against disease-causing agents, which anything that causes disease is a pathogen, which is why I put pathogens in parentheses. You know what the word innate means? Sometimes you hear about people having like an innate ability to do something. You know what that means? For example, we all have an innate ability to breathe. Is that something that had to develop over time? or were we born with it? We were born with it, right? If not, we wouldn't be here. Okay. We have some born with defense mechanisms. We have a lot of them, actually. Okay. We've also got stuff that we've developed over time, which is what adaptive immunity refers to. Okay. And those target specific things, what we call antigens. And that's not the first time we've seen the word antigen before, is it? We talked about antigens back when we talked about blood typing. Type A, remember, had A antigens. B had B antigens. Okay. Those, as we learned, were proteins, glycoproteins, glycolipids found on cells. In that case, the antigens were on the red blood cells. But viruses and bacteria also have these molecular targets on their cells. Or in the case of bacteria, they are single cells. Okay. So we seek and destroy those. So we can classify the two types of immunity as innate or non-specific. Includes our external physical and chemical barriers provided by our skin, mucous membranes, as well as some internal defenses. Once again, innate or non-specific kind of can be used interchangeably to describe that it's present at birth and that there's no specific recognition, which means there's no memory component. Our body's going to protect the same way using this defense mechanism as it would for a virus, as it would for a bacteria, as it would for a fungus. It's just going to protect it the same way no matter what. Okay. Collectively, our innate or non-specific immunity is conferred by our first line and second lines of defense, which, just like in the military, are the first two things that generally go into battle, the first two divisions that go into battle. Okay. Unfortunately, just like in the military, things can still get through. And sometimes we have to bring in the big dogs. It's what the adaptive or specific immunity provides us. Specific recognition of invaders. I can't talk. Memory component. That's the key with adaptive. This is performed by those lymphocytes. Okay, those major soldiers that we've been talking about now going on a few weeks. They target specific molecular targets known as antigens, which are found on the pathogens. Difference between innate and adaptive immunity can be understood by examining the receptor proteins on the cell surface, providing each category of immunity. Our innate immune system responds to molecules characteristic of invading microorganisms like bacteria, but not of human cells. Adaptive immune system response is mounted against very specific molecular targets with antigens, usually foreign molecules, but can also be molecules produced by human cells. We will talk about autoimmune diseases, where the immune system fails to recognize self cells and then attacks them. We've mentioned Parkinson's in this class before. We'll talk about things like multiple sclerosis and rheumatoid arthritis. Allergies are actually kind of a failure of the immune system. When I say kind of, I mean really a failure of the immune system. First, let's talk about our innate immunity, and we'll talk about the first and second lines of defense. First line of defense includes our skin and mucous membranes, providing both physical and chemical barriers, discouraging pathogens and foreign substances from penetrating the body, causing disease. Physical barriers include the epidermis, which, if you've taken anatomy or are taking anatomy, all of you in here have. We should know the epidermis is the outer layer of our skin, which we've also learned is constantly being replaced because we are constantly shedding off the outside layers of our skin. The way that our cells are built provides a physical barrier to the entrance of cell, but that periodic shedding helps remove and prevent bacteria and other microbes from just colonizing the outside of our body. The mucous membranes that line our body cavities also act as a physical barrier. Think of that like a Glue trap. I put glue traps in my basement when I get mice or bugs. Okay, it sticks the mouse to it or the bug to it. The bug or mouse can't get off. I can get rid of the rodent or insect that way. The glue in this case is mucus. That's going to find itself, or that is producing these body cavities. We also have other structures associated with the mucus, like in our nose. There are hairs. In our upper respiratory tract, there's cilia that help to move that mucus and the stuff that's stuck to it up and out. We'll either cough it up, spit it out, or in some cases, throw it down into our stomach where the gastric juice in our stomach digests it. Coughing and sneezing can help accelerate the movement of mucus and it can trap pathogens out of the body, whereas swallowing it also helps protect us. Fluids, like our tears produced by the lacrimal apparatus of our eye. Even when we're not in a crying, emotional state, we're constantly producing and draining tears to help moisten our eye, but in the case of immunity, help dilute microbes and keep them from settling on the surface of our eye. On top of that, we've got a chemical within our tears, as well as in our saliva, sweat, nasal secretions, and tissue fluids, called lysozyme. Lysozyme pokes holes in a bacteria cell wall, kind of like what happens to a balloon if you poke a hole in it. What happens to the balloon? Basically dies, right? So do bacteria if you break through their cell walls. Saliva washes microbes from the surface of our teeth, from the mucous membrane of the mouth. Urine cleanses the urinary system, prevents colonization of microbes. Vaginal secretions moves microbes out of the body in females. And then defecation and vomiting also expel microbes. Chemicals like sebum protect us. Sebum is produced by our sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands is a fancy way to describe your oil glands, and oil is the less fancy word of the word sebum. Sebum, or oil, forms a protective film over the skin. Within that fluid there are unsaturated fatty acids that inhibit the growth of certain pathogenic bacteria and fungi. Our skin also produces sweat or perspiration that helps flush microbes from the surface of the skin. I've already mentioned the importance of stomach fluid. Gastric juice, very, very acidic because of the hydrochloric acid. Most bacteria don't like that pH. They become denatured and die in our stomach. Vaginal secretions in females are also slightly acidic, discouraging bacterial growth. Unfortunately, just like in the military, the first line of defense is not always going to be impenetrable. So that's where you'd want to, obviously, send in the second line of defense. We don't have to send it in because the stuff's invading us, but we have a second line of defense set of structures or mechanisms like our antimicrobial substances, natural killer cells, and phagocytes that would go to work after the first line has failed. We'll talk about second line of defense and those various things first thing on Wednesday.